Welcome everybody to the Division III August webinar. Today we will discuss COVID-19 and waiver updates. My name is Zach Romash. I will be joined by Jeff Myers and Bill Reagan on the webinar, and then we also have some additional NCA staff working the question and answer. First, we will go over the agenda. We will start off by talking about the student athlete reinstatement previously approved list. We'll then discuss full-time enrollment waivers, go into the 2020-21 academic year proactive blanket waivers, specifically season of participation waivers and extension of eligibilities. Next, we will talk virtual recruiting waivers, membership waivers, alternate playing seasons model, and then lastly, questions and answers. We ask with regards to question and answers, please use the question and answer box and feature, and our NCA staff will filter out the questions to make sure that they're answered appropriately. Okay, first we are going to discuss the student athlete reinstatement previously approved waiver list, specifically with regards to the 10 semester 15 quarter rule waiver relating to COVID-19 and the pandemic year. This waiver specifically applies to student athletes that competed during the 2020 spring semester. So these student athletes will qualify for a 1 semester extension if they were unable to participate in their sport during the 2020 spring semester or quarter due to COVID-19, or they participated limitedly and received a season of participation waiver during the 2020 spring term. As you remember, based on the administrative committee's actions, student athletes, spring 2020 student athletes were not charged with the use of a semester during 2020 spring term. So what this previously approved waiver allows student athletes to do, spring sports student athletes that want to continue maintaining full-time enrollment through fall 11, for example, or fall 2020 and spring 2021, this allows them to continue that enrollment with a 1 semester extension. Please note the previously approved waiver list only applies to 2020 spring sports student athletes, and some of the application of it, the extension must be used immediately following the expiration of the student athlete's 10 semester 15 quarter period of eligibility. So basically, looking at this waiver and this previously approved waiver list, it allows a student athlete that wasn't charged with a term in the spring 2020 to an additional semester, and that applies to all student athletes regardless of what year. If the student athlete does not meet the terms outlined in the previously approved waiver list, the institution should submit an extension request to this directly to the student athlete reinstatement staff. Again, this waiver only applies to 2020 spring sports student athletes and allows them to continue to maintain full-time enrollment if they would like. And we've also listed some case precedent that is searchable in RSRO. The NCA student athlete, Division III student athlete reinstatement list is also available through the NCA SAR website. So if you want to take a look at that list, that kind of outlines the same circumstances here. So that will kind of encompass that waiver. Next slide, please.
Yeah, Zach, thank you. This is Bill Reagan. And as Zach mentioned, based upon the actions that occurred last spring, we had a number of institutions asking about enrollment for their student athletes for the 2020-21 academic year. It's important to note that the enrollment requirements for 2020-21 have not changed, which means a student athlete needs to be enrolled full-time in order to practice and compete, or meet an exception for full-time enrollment. Final term exception would be an example. So there were a lot of questions that resulted for student athletes now who were maybe going to finish their eligibility, would have finished their eligibility last year, and now find themselves with an additional 2 terms and an additional season, but yet they may have graduated. That question was taken to the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief, and in those instances, they've reviewed several waiver requests. The committee, while evaluating those waiver requests, created the following criteria. that should be considered by an institution who's looking to submit any type of request for less than full-time enrollment for a student athlete. Really 3 criteria. First, the expectation is student athletes must remain students while participating. That means student athletes need to be enrolled not full-time, but need to be enrolled in some classes. Student athletes can't expect to practice while not enrolled in any classes. This is really where the subcommittee was leaning. Additionally, that coursework really should be intentional. It should really go to further an academic or career goal for the student athlete. A lot of autonomy here in determining what that means for the individual student athlete. Examples that the subcommittee has dealt with is a student athlete maybe who's taking a couple classes or a class in order to prepare for their career, or that they were taking some prerequisite classes to get into graduate school. The subcommittee looked favorably upon those requests. They weren't really looking at the number of hours, rather than the student athlete was enrolled in some classes, that those classes had a purpose that were either furthering the student athlete's academic or career goals. Finally, whatever the plan that's being proposed for that student athlete's enrollment, that plan would be approved by some academic authority outside of athletics. That really depends on each institution. Is it an academic advisor? Maybe it's appropriated to a certain institution. Is it the registrar? Is it a department head? That really is up to the institution to determine. But what the subcommittee is really looking for is this plan been approved by someone outside of athletics, someone who has some academic oversight for that individual student athlete. So the subcommittee has not looked at waiver requests for student athletes based upon changes in this alternative playing and practice season model. The requests that they really have looked at to this date have really based upon additional eligibility that a student athlete has moving into the 2021 academic year. So we'd encourage institutions to submit appropriate cases for those student athletes maybe who are going to be enrolled part-time or are going to be enrolled in something other than a full-time course load. So with that, I will stop, see if there are any questions. Okay, Josh, I think we can move on to the next slide. I think back to Zach.
Thanks, Bill. So next we are going to move into the 2020 academic year and discuss blanket waivers. So as you hopefully are aware, there's been 2 blanket waivers that have been kind of preemptive blanket waivers that have been passed at this point. The first is a season of participation waiver. And basically this blanket waiver waives the existing season of participation waiver and notes that if a student athlete's team competes in or is unable to complete 50% or less of the contest or dates of competition maximums, that the student athlete will get the season of participation waiver. So they'll get the season back. They will not be charged. So again, that's if the institution's team is unable to complete 50% or less of, or more, basically, if you cannot finish 50% or more of your season, you would get that waiver. So one of the things to note, I think that's important, that is if the team completes more than 50% of the season, but a student athlete just does not play in more than 50%, they would not automatically qualify for this blanket waiver, and that would need to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis on the by the student athlete reinstatement staff. So again, really looking at the bylaw 17 contest maximums and whether or not the team completes 50% or less to be able to qualify for this waiver. Along with that, there's also a preemptive extension of eligibility blanket waiver. This basically notes that if the student athlete season is either canceled or they're unable to participate in the sport during the 2020 academic year due to the impact of COVID-19, they will get a 2-semester extension. Additionally, if the student athlete receives the season of participation waiver that we previously outlined just a second ago, they would also qualify for the extension. So if you receive the season of participation waiver, you would also receive the 2-semester extension. The only thing with regards to conditions to that is that the student athlete was otherwise eligible. So again, basically a year extension, 2-semester. And then if you participate in 50% or less of the contest maximum, the student athlete would receive a season of participation waiver, would not be charged with a season. I think it's important to note there is a lot of questions and the circumstances are surrounding these blanket waivers are still kind of evolving. So the staff will provide further clarification regarding blanket waivers. Realize that there's multiple questions and continue to be questions. So we will continue to provide education and updates as this, waivers and the details are rattled out here. So again, just kind of basics of this blanket waiver: 50% or less, you would receive the season of participation waiver. And then if you do not compete due to COVID or you receive the season of participation waiver, you would get a 2-semester extension. So I will stop there.
Okay, thanks. We have received some questions through the Q&A, so thank you for submitting. Our first question is, if a track and field student athlete competed in indoor in 2019 or 1920 and not outdoor in 2020 because of COVID-19, does that student athlete get the extension of the 10th semester, or did they use it because they competed in indoor?
Yeah, thank you. So the question with regards to indoor and outdoor track and field is a great question. If the student athlete is a spring sport student athlete, they would receive that extension in outdoor track and fields. And so basically the little bit complex of an answer, but they would be able to enroll in the fall and in the spring for outdoor track and field. With regards to indoor track and field, the spring 2020 still does not count towards their clock based on the administrative committee's actions. But if they have seasons remaining in indoor, the fall 2020 would be their 10th semester in indoor track and field. So that's just something to note. They would not qualify for the spring because extensions on a student athlete reinstatement analysis are sport specific. So again, the outdoor track and field student athlete would get the 1-semester extension with the previously approved list, be able to stay enrolled the entire term. With regards to indoor track and field, that 10th semester, if they choose to enroll in the fall, they can compete that fall, but they would not have the spring for indoor. So a little bit different based on the sports.
Thank you, Zach. Another question from the Q&A. We are going to a 3-term year-round model, meaning student athletes will be on campus in the summer. Can we use summer days as part of the 114 days of the season?
And Allie, this is Jeff. I will jump in on that one. And we'll address this a little bit when we get into the alternative playing season model, but it would not allow summer participation. Now, if there is some unique circumstances with a particular institution where the summer is a required term and some other factors are present, it may justify a individual waiver for that particular institution. But the new or the alternative playing season model in the 114 days would not allow it to go past the end of the regular academic term and proceed into a summer term.
Thank you, Jeff. Let's see, if student athletes are enrolled full-time but are remote, are they eligible for practice and competition? If there will be competition.
And you know what, I'm going to ask maybe the group just to hold on that one for a moment until we get to the alternative playing season, because we will address eligibility in that part of the discussion.
Well, let's move back to the presentation, and as we move forward with questions that flow with our conversation, I will ask them.
Yeah, I think we're moving to the next slide. Thank you. This is Bill again. late spring, the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief issued a waiver that would permit a member institution to use a number of virtual platforms to conduct recruiting events. This was originally approved by the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief. It was in response to institutions who requested that they be able to conduct events that they typically would otherwise have conducted had their campuses not been closed for COVID-19. So they're asked, instead of having these open house events or these junior days, can they do these virtually? And the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief approved a blanket waiver that allowed member institutions, athletic department staffs, coaches to conduct virtual recruiting events with multiple prospective student athletes on those electronic platforms through the course of the spring all the way through the summer. Now that particular waiver expired August 1, 2020. The Subcommittee for Legislative Relief, based on a recommendation from the Interpretations Legislative Committee, has extended that waiver. The ILC polled and received a lot of feedback from the membership about how virtual recruiting platforms are being used currently in the recruiting model. And it became pretty aware that this has really augmented in many of your recruitment, especially now that you can't have recruiting visits on your campus. So a decision was made, a recommendation rather was made by ILC to Subcommittee for Legislative Relief to approve the waiver. So a new blanket waiver has been approved by the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief that was effective August 1, 2020. And effectively, it allows institutions to continue to use virtual recruiting platforms that engage multiple prospective student athletes. However, there are a few differences from the prior blanket waiver based upon how it's being used, questions we've received, as well as feedback from student athletes and member institutions. Some of those parameters are there's a chat function, and that continues to be permissible. What that allows is during these virtual recruiting presentations, there can be interaction between the prospective student athletes, their parents, and others who are attending that event with the presenters. So there can be an actual dialogue. This would not be dissimilar to what you would experience actually on a campus. The second point is these virtual recruiting presentations can also include outside groups and are not limited by age or grade level. This aligns with really the phone call in which virtual recruiting platforms are akin to in our current legislation. The next consideration or parameter for the waiver is the institution doesn't have to initiate the event. The event could be initiated by an outside group, and an institution's coach can be involved in that particular event, provided all the other parameters are met. The next part is probably the biggest change. Can student athletes be involved in these recruiting events? The answer is still yes. However, there's a few limitations now. Some of those limitations are the student athlete's involvement must be voluntary, can only occur during the academic year, and the student athlete cannot miss class to participate in a virtual recruiting event. And finally, this issue of publicity. Can an institute publicize these virtual recruiting events? The answer is yes. However, what the institution cannot do is publicize a prospective student athlete's involvement in the event. What that means, if you record an event and you can see actual prospective student athletes, that would not be permissible to show. However, the institution could publicize the event, and if the event did not highlight or didn't make a prospective student athlete visible, that institution could, could record that particular event. So you can certainly publicize the event. What you cannot do is publicize an individual prospective student athletes or promote an individual prospective student athlete's involvement in the event. So this waiver will actually continue through this following next academic year. And if legislation is going to be recommended by ILC or the governance structure to include virtual recruiting as a legislative proposal into the 2022 legislative cycle, this will actually go all the way to 2022 convention. So really it will depend upon what happens in the legislative cycle. but at least for this next academic year, that this blanket waiver will be effective. So I'll stop to see if there's any questions. Okay, if not, then we can just move to the next slide. We've received some questions about membership waivers, and the membership committee has really taken action and provided a waiver of the minimum number of contests for sports sponsorship for the 2021 academic year. It's effectively reduced that minimum by 33%. Now, that's the only waiver the membership committee has taken thus far. In their meeting at the end of this month, they are going to continue to review membership requirements for the 2021 academic year to see if they're all still appropriate based upon the alternative playing and practice season model that Jeff will talk about shortly. One of the things they're going to look at is this requirement that you must have one all-male, one all-female team competing in each season, and how those contests play out over those particular seasons. So they're going to begin to look at those requirements as well as some others. I say that because if you're going to file a waiver of a membership requirement, you should only do that once you know for sure that your institution will not satisfy the requirement. So actually, until the membership committee resolves these other issues, it would be difficult for any institution to say that it knows for sure it won't need a membership requirement at this point in time. However, maybe after the August meeting and some of these other membership requirements have been resolved, your institution may say, you know, that we cannot meet the membership requirements for the 2020-21 academic year. At that point, and only at that point, should you start talking about submitting a waiver to the membership committee. Certainly encourage you to reach out to our staff liaisons, Eric Hartung and Corey Berg or Tiffany Alford, to talk about any potential waivers that you may have. So I will stop to see if there's any questions.
So Bill, a couple waiver questions coming in. Are we considering a blanket waiver for the student athlete who is in their 10th semester this fall, but their sport has moved to spring competition?
Yeah,
Bill,
Zach,
you can answer
probably
that.
more for you to answer.
Yes. So right now, for student athletes that their fall term is their 10th semester, and let's say they're a fall sport and their season has been moved to the spring, they currently don't really fall into any of the blanket waivers based on the unique circumstances. So the institution in that case would need to file an extension of eligibility through the RSRO system to the student athlete reinstatement staff. That will, the staff will review that, likely, not barring it, barring any issues, it should be approved based on the season being canceled and being pushed back. If we get enough of those waivers with similar circumstances, we may be able to move that to the previously approved list, and so that institutions can self-apply. We have not received any of those yet. So for right now, an institution would need to just submit an extension for a student athlete that's fall term is their 10th semester to be able to compete in the spring.
Thanks, Zach and Bill. And moving to our next cue, I will wait for the 114-day questions, but does season of participation waiver include a semester waiver?
Zach,
yeah, yeah, the blanket season of participation waiver, if you qualify for that, as noted, then basically the student athlete would automatically receive a 2-semester extension. So if the student athlete receives the blanket waiver given their team didn't complete more than 50% and they're eligible, they would automatically also qualify for a 2-semester extension. So basically a year extension. So they kind of go hand in hand. If you receive one, you would also receive the other.
Ellie, I wonder if there's not a good time maybe to move to the alternative playing model. I think a lot of the questions are there.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you. So this is Jeff Myers, Director of Academic and Membership Affairs. So glad to be with you this afternoon and talk about this alternative playing season model that the Management Council just approved last week. President's Council will take final action on it tomorrow, but have indicated their support of this model. And I think the first piece to note, this is not a replacement of what the current playing season regulations are. Rather, it's an optional model to be considered to be potentially used on campus if it fits your particular needs. And to give a little bit of a background of kind of the process, I think is important. There's a subgroup of the Management Council charged to look at different playing season regulations, playing seasons issues. And as the summer sort of unfolded, and we certainly saw schools and conferences indicating their intentions for the fall and canceling competitions. As institutions looked at the upcoming year with the general uncertainty of what it would bring, this subgroup took a look at the playing season to say, how can the playing season regulations effectively be amended, adapted to account for some of this uncertainty, to provide institutions the ability to conduct some semblance of a playing season for the benefit of the student athlete without some of the regulations that currently exist. And as they engaged in this, they wrestled with really the process that many of the committees have wrestled with through this pandemic and looking at our NCAA regulations. That being the necessity to offer flexibility, the necessity to be responsive to our institutions, and balancing that with not jeopardizing, not compromising the foundational principles that Division III is based on. And so when they engaged in this discussion, they really did in the framework of 4 principles. And the first one being that any alternative playing season or any amendments should not compromise the health and safety of student athletes. Any amendment should foster a positive student athlete experience. Any amendments should maintain the guiding principle that the playing season regulations are regulated to minimize interference with the academic program of student athletes. And the final one, recognizing that institutional viability issues, enrollment management, personnel limitations, resources, et cetera, need to be evaluated as part of any proposed changes. And so it's within that framework that the subgroup developed this alternative model. Ultimately, that was, again, approved by Management Council last week. From a high-level perspective, what does this model do? What are the primary differences? Well, one, it really looks at the playing season for all sports, whether it's fall, winter, or spring, from an entire academic year perspective. Second, it eliminates the definition of the playing season in weeks, which is the current model, and transforms it to days. And those days do not have to occur consecutively. They do not have to occur in consecutive weeks. And it is really intended to provide flexibility for institutions, regardless of what the circumstances are on campus, to be able to still provide their student athletes some type of experience, not knowing what lies ahead. And the final piece of that is, because it's an entire academic year season to some extent, that there's no longer a distinction between traditional and non-traditional segments. We're really looking at days, and we'll get into that in just a moment, and we'll go to the next slide. Okay, what you have here is just a chart kind of giving the basic outline of the model. For each season, it is based on 114 days. And why 114 days? Effectively, we looked at what is the longest current playing season, the winter sports model, in which there are no non-traditional segments, but just a 19-week season, and the maximum amount could be 6 days a week. And so just took that over the 19 weeks and we got 114 days. And for simplicity purposes, apply that to all the seasons, so fall and spring as well. So what you have first is 114 days in which to conduct athletic related activity. That's competitions, that's practice, that's required workouts, required meetings, whether they're virtual, in person. Anything under the current definition that would constitute an activity that would have to occur within the playing season, it's something that would constitute one of the 114 days. If it's a current exception to the playing season, those activities that can occur under the current regulations outside the playing season, those voluntary workouts, those type of things, they would not have to constitute one of the 114 days. It's important to note that the 114 days is team specific, so it's not student athlete specific. So the 114 days applies to your soccer teams. It does not apply to each student, so not each student athlete necessarily gets 114 days, but it's your team gets 114 days. The other piece to the days is that there still has to be a day off in a given week. Now, each team can define the week the way they want it, but there has to be at least one day off during that defined week. So similar to current rules, still protecting student athlete, giving that student athlete that day off per week. The first permissible practice dates, for the most part, are the same as the current regulations. A couple changes for fall sports. There was already a waiver that allowed practice to start August 10th or the first day of class for all fall sports, as well as golf, tennis, and rowing. So that is a change. For winter sports, it's the same for all except for basketball, ice hockey, and wrestling, which now has an October 1st as their first permissible practice date. So it moved a little earlier in the calendar year. Spring sports, again, for the golf, tennis, and rowing, you still have that August 10th date. For all their sports, it's the existing bylaw. It says September 7th or the first day of class. The contest dates have not changed for any of the sports. So important to recognize, again, with basketball, hockey, and those that have specific contest dates, while the first permissible practice date has changed, the first contest date has not. And then the end of the season is really, again, the end of the academic year. So for the fall and the winter sports, 5 weekdays before the first day of the institution's final exams. For your spring sports, the conclusion of the NCAA championships. And so next slide, please. All right, a few additional considerations here when we talk about contest limits. If an institution is applying this alternative model, they will be allowed to participate in the number of contests that are permissible pursuant to the traditional segment contest limits. So whatever that is for the particular sport, that's the limit that applies under this alternative model. Eligibility, I know we've had, I think, a few questions in the Q&A chat regarding eligibility. Nothing's changed as far as eligibility to practice or compete. So even though the model is different, the eligibility requirements are still the same. To participate in a practice, to participate in a competition, it's still enrolled full-time. Competition enrolled full-time and at least 12 hours. All those that still apply would apply under this model. Male practice players. Under the current rule, male practice players are only allowed in the traditional segment once a week and in a number not to exceed half of a starting lineup for the particular sport. Under this model, they'll still be allowed to be used under, again, once a week. That still applies. The number limits as far as half the roster still apply, but they'd be able to apply throughout the entire year. So again, only once a week, but since there's not a designate difference between traditional and non-traditional segment under this alternative model, any week of the year they would be allowed to participate. Out of season athletic related activities, I know this is a piece that is always difficult under the current rule. The analysis doesn't change under this alternative model. If it is something that occurs on a day other than one of your 114 days, it has to be either an exception or voluntary type activity, that same analysis under the current model that says, can you do this activity outside the season, would apply under this model is, can you do this activity outside of the 114 days? So again, the analysis is still the same, just whether or not that counts as a day or not a day. Outside competition. This was one that the subgroup of management council took a look at, because under the current model, when you have a very defined playing season through the weeks, becomes very simple to say whether a student athlete has engaged as a member of an outside team during those weeks, which would then render that person ineligible, or they engage in outside competition outside of those weeks, which is permissible. Because this model doesn't give that clear line definition, this has been deferred to the institutions. So if institutions are comfortable with their student athletes participating on outside teams, that again would be deferred to the institution. So there wouldn't be a specific outside competition prohibition under this alternative model. And then the final piece I just wanted to address here has to do with the designation of the playing season. The purpose of this model was to provide flexibility, knowing that a lot of things may change as the year goes on. So defining the playing season on the front end, knowing that it had to be amended probably multiple times, didn't seem to make a lot of sense to that group. Rather, is a tracking mechanism to ensure that the teams do not exceed their dates, and however that is best applied on your campus should be applied. It does not have to be designated prior to the start of the year, but rather there should be some type of written, recorded mechanism to ensure that the teams did not exceed their day limits. So that was a lot. We have posted a Q&A on this alternative playing season model on ncaa.org on the Division III compliance page. It starts to answer a lot of these questions, a lot of the questions. We understand fully that there will continue to be questions on this model. This model is intended to help institutions provide an experience for their student athletes, and we will certainly try to respond to questions under that sort of overarching principle as we go forward. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide, which is the question slide. And Allie, I haven't been able to see a lot of the Q&A, but I'm sure there's a few questions here on the
just a few. And thank you everyone for submitting your questions. Just a frame of reference, we are recording this session, so we will make sure to make this available, and we're also taking down all the questions. So if we do not get your question today on the webinar, know that we will follow up and are keeping track of your questions, and this is very useful for our AMA team to know what to answer in your Q&A. So to dive into our questions, I know I saw a lot about what will postseason be counted in the 114 days as well as in the 50% waiver.
So Allie, I'll start with this and then turn it over to Zach or Bill for part of it. But for the 114 days, the NCAA postseason is not counted. So the exemptions to the weeks are still not counted. Conference tournaments, as they are now, have to occur within your week's limitations, would have to occur within the day limitations. With respect to the 50% waiver, before getting to the exact answer, and I know there's a lot of questions on the 50% waiver. I think to take a step back on that particular issue and looking at the initial purpose of what that waiver is provide. The initial purpose of that waiver from the reinstatement committee and ultimately from the administrative committee is, when issued in this summer, was to provide institutions some clarity to suggest that if their seasons were cut short due to COVID and were not able to give their student athletes a full season, it established a benchmark in which those student athletes would ultimately not be charged with the season. As you know, right now, the current rule says once a student athlete participates in a competition or participates in a practice after the first opportunity to compete, they have used a season. This extends it quite a bit, given the uncertainty at the time of the summer, to say, if you come and start to participate on a team and that is cut short and you haven't exceeded 50% of that season, that's not going to count against you. And I say that to put this in context, because these type of waivers are typically not issued proactively. These are issued on an individual basis, based on the circumstances specific to a student athlete. But there is some legislative basis for these type of waivers, season of participation waivers, and that's where a lot of this analysis and interpretation comes from. It certainly doesn't preclude institutions on the back end coming back and asking student athletes for particular waivers to get their season back. But with that, I don't know if Zach or Bill want to address the specifics of postseason. I'm trying to remember, was it postseason with respect to the 50% rule or 50% waiver?
Yeah, Jeff, I think that there's been some questions on that. I think and feel free, Jeff, to chime in. I think that we've received a lot of questions on it from a student athlete reinstatement and a season of participation waiver analysis. The 50%, the denominator, is based on the contest maximum. So, you take 50% of the contest maximums. With regards to the numerator, the student athlete's participation in the season of participation waiver legislation notes that basically any competition counts towards that. So if a student athlete played in 50% of a season and then, plays the regular season and then plays in, the conference championship, and then, for example, maybe the NCAA championship, those dates of competition or contest that would count in the numerator. So you would technically exceed, and that's based on the way season of participation legislation reads for season of participation waivers. So that's the guidance that we've given now from a student athlete reinstatement perspective, because that's how the legislation, adopted by the membership reads with regards to those waivers.
And just it's 14.2.7, so bylaw 14.2.7 that addresses the season of participation waivers and that sort of legislative criteria. So Allie, additional questions?
Yep, and while you're on the 114 days, and I don't think you covered this, will resocialization days be counted in that 114?
So if athletically related activity occurs on those days, yes, it would be counted in those 114 days. So if you think about it as engaging in any type of team meetings, where game strategy, anything beyond compliance forms and administrative type tasks, that would count as a day. So yes, it would count as a day.
Thanks, Jeff. And then we have a lot of questions about virtual workouts and practices. Can you reiterate some of the details behind that?
Sure. So obviously we're hearing a number of schools are going completely online. And so what does that mean for student athletes? Are they on campus? What type of in-person interaction do they have? When we talk about in terms of virtual workouts, the first thing that any institution needs to do is to discuss with their medical professionals and risk management professionals and determine what is appropriate for their student athletes at their institution. When we look at virtual type workouts from an NCAA perspective, that's the first thing. Are the best practices put in place? And when we think about workouts generally, thinking about having an AED available. Think about, when you're talking about outside the season, certified strength and conditioning coaches that are certified also in first aid and AED use, and all those type of considerations. That's the first piece. And when you talk about conducting virtual workouts under this model, it accounts for allowing that if it counts for a day. If institutions are conducting virtual workouts and want to incorporate today, this model allows for it. But again, the first piece always has to go to the health and safety aspect of it. And so I would suggest if you're at an institution that has gone completely online and virtual workouts is the only avenue for you, first consult the medical personnel risk management to ensure that the health and safety protocols can be put in place to even conduct a virtual workout.
Thanks, Jeff. And then also with our new leadership programming legislation, do those still fall into non-athletic related activities?
They would. So that's, again, under this model, all the exceptions that apply under the existing regulations that would take something out of an activity that has to occur within the season, like this new leadership legislation that was passed at convention, to say these are not athletic related activities. They can occur, I believe it's 10 times over the year outside the season. That exception would still apply under this alternative format.
Great. And then to follow up with some of the Q&A information provided, seems to be conflicting information in the Q&A for when fall sports are competing in the spring semester, when they need to have days off for finals. Q5 indicates fall term, but Q2 indicates a requirement to take 5 days off prior to any finals, which would include spring. Can that expectation be clarified for fall sports competing in the spring? And do they need to take the 5 days off prior to spring finals?
As of now, they would have to take the 5 days off prior to spring end of year finals. Their season would end 5 days before the end of season finals.
And Jeff, there's a few questions about how to track the 114 days. Do you have any best practices to share?
Considering this is brand new to all of us, I don't think we have any best practices to share. It would certainly be on the institution and what works best for them, and would encourage institutions to talk with each other to see what mechanisms work best for them. But yes, given the newness of this, and I don't know that we've heard many best practices at this point.
Thank you. And with conferences that moved out of the fall semester, might only schedule a partial schedule in the spring due to staff overload, resocialization, practicality, etc. If the team does not exceed the 50%, do those students receive another season?
They would. That's correct. So they would fall under that blanket waiver that says they would get the season back as well as a 2-semester extension. And sorry, Zach, I just jumped and stepped on your toes there.
No problem. I was reading through some of the other questions, so I appreciate it.
And while we gather other questions, if a student is enrolled full-time but learning remotely, can they still receive instruction and engage with the coaching staff in athletically related activities?
So if they are considered enrolled full-time by your institution and satisfy all other eligibility requirements for practice, then yes, they could engage in team meetings that way, yes.
And then Jeff, Bill, and Zach, as you are reading through the Q&As and answering to some, are there any particulars that you'd like to answer at this time?
I think and I'll let Bill and Zach jump in on any particulars, but I would just note that we are going to update the Q&A. If not the end of this week, then sometime in the middle of next, specifically with respect to the 50% waiver piece, because we have received quite a few questions there, and certainly want to bring some of this clarification to the membership on that issue. But again, the playing and practice season 1 has already been posted, but I would look forward to more information coming out on the 50% waiver piece as well. So I don't know, Zach or Bill, if you saw any questions in the Q&A that you think need to be addressed at this point in time.
Yeah, Jeff, I would echo your comments. I think one of the questions that I saw that's probably just worth addressing is if a student athlete chooses to opt out, will they qualify for an extension of blanket waiver? I think from our perspective, there'll be more on that in the Q&A, but just know, the staff would, from an SAR perspective, the staff will provide flexibility in those cases, with regards to a student athlete choosing to opt out. So more to come on the process with that, but I don't think there should be, concern about the student athlete being charged, not being able to get an extension based on that decision.
Bill, anything additional from you?
No, Jeff, I think you covered it. Just to reiterate, I think the 114 days has still some moving parts, but so does the 50% waiver. And I think how these two combine based upon the changing landscape for Division III intercollegiate athletics, I think is all led to us having to make sure that they all kind of align together, which we are working through. So.
Great. So Allie, like I said, any questions that are, we'll use the questions in this chat function as well to help develop those Q&As and certainly make them complete. But as Bill suggested, this is evolving. Things change day by day regarding calendars and the abilities of institutions to conduct sports and when they can conduct sports. So certainly trying to be responsive to the needs, the governance structure that represents you, your peers, ADs, conference commissioners, and athletic staff throughout our institutions have represented you all well on the committees, have certainly worked overtime to help provide these options and to provide the insight to give this greater flexibility that's represented in the membership waivers, the eligibility waivers, the alternative playing season. So, and they will continue to do so, and will continue to evolve as more information becomes available. So with that, Allie, is there anything additional that we need to address?
I mean, maybe if you want to take a little time to talk about virtual recruiting, we've received some questions on that, and then we can wrap it up. I think if that's a day of competition, how they can work with the recruit, if you could touch on that.
Sure, and I'll defer to Bill for that discussion.
Yeah, so right now the blanket waiver permits an institution to conduct virtual recruiting events. So institutions would normally conduct events on their campus, unofficial visits, sometimes individual student athletes, sometimes group of student athletes. And really what the waivers intend to do is permit those type of activities now to occur on a virtual platform. That really is the only change. So unofficial visits, official visits, activities that institutions would normally do on their campus, all that stuff stays the same. Really what has just happened is to say now the things that you normally would have done on your unofficial visits, you can do via this virtual platform. And the reason we had to get a waiver is the current legislation says that these virtual platforms are akin to a phone call. And phone calls must be private, which means between one individual and one prospective student athlete. These virtual recruiting platforms engage multiple prospective student athletes, and that really is the purpose for the legislative relief waiver. But apart from that, all other the recruiting legislations have remained the same. So there should be no changes there. So Ellie, was there anything else in the virtual recruiting space?
I think you covered it there. I'm just trying to dive back into our published. And then just to be clear, a student enrolled full-time in classes in the fall 2020, but whose sport has been canceled by the institution for the semester would lose a semester of eligibility.
Yes, so it's a good question. So if it's a fall sport and ultimately it is not, this institution is unable to sponsor that sport during the 2021 academic year, that student athlete would receive a 2-semester extension based on the blanket waiver. I think with regards to the fall sport, if that institution, I think after the fall, they're still charged with a use of a semester, and it's not until the spring, because the institution can still potentially sponsor that sport in the spring until they're able to receive that extension. Now, if the student athlete's in his 10th semester in the fall, the institution could just submit an extension request to the student athlete reinstatement staff. But ultimately, if an institution is unable to sponsor a sport during the 2021 academic year, that student athlete will receive a 2-semester extension to their 10-semester period of eligibility based on the blanket waiver.
Thank you, Zach. And going back to being fully remote, if an institution is fully remote, can coaches conduct mandatory virtual practices such as skills work, strength and conditioning, strategy? I know any such days will count towards the 114 days. Is that true if they're fully remote?
So first, obviously, if they're considered enrolled full-time. Second, with both this alternative format and the existing legislation for in-season activities, so under the existing legislation, in-season here under a days, the legislation doesn't dictate the manner and scope of the practice. For example, there's not an hour limit on a traditional practice. So you conceivably could run a 12-hour practice. You're not going to do that. And certainly health and safety protocols would say, don't do that. And so I think that's the same way to look at the virtual workouts. Yes, a coach could conduct a virtual practice under this model. It would count as a day, but you're still subject to the health and safety protocols at your institution. And so again, it points you back towards your risk management people, your medical people on campus to determine what and to what extent those activities should occur.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And then one question. I know there's no distinction between traditional and non-traditional seasons, but will football be allowed to wear equipment for the entirety of the 114 days after the acclimation period?
So that's a great question, Allie. The initial answer is yes. What we're continuing to look at is, does an acclimatization period need to apply again in the spring if you have a significant break between your practices? So if you had started fall football, you completed the acclimatization period, you've practiced a few weeks, continue to practice in the fall, stopped, and you want to engage again in the spring with full pads. What's currently being looked at is, does that acclimatization period need to apply again in the spring? We don't have an answer yet on that. We will. It is being looked at by our competitive safeguards group. But at that point, that we can't answer yet. But the reality is you could conduct football competitions in the spring under this model.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and to Zach and Bill today. That will be our last question for today. And thank you for attending our webinar for August. And just a reminder that we will send a recording of the webinar and answer any questions not addressed. So thank you for your time today and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.